All right, great. Thank you, and good morning, everyone. So I think it was mentioned at the beginning of the webinar that I kind of had this sprung on me yesterday, so I'm kind of winging it, but I've reviewed the presentation and I'm pretty familiar with all of this content, so I think it'll be okay. And I am here today on behalf of my boss, the Deputy Director for State and Private Forestry, Chris Fisher. And I would say, you know, a lot of the information I'm going to share, at least in the beginning of this presentation, is probably familiar to a lot of you, so apologies for duplication. I noticed that my colleague Jeff Moore presented at the last webinar in this series on our aerial detection survey program. And so again, some of this information up front you might have already seen. But in case there are folks who weren't part of that webinar or who haven't seen this before, I do want to spend a little time just providing this background information. So the Forest Service, as everybody probably knows, flies an annual aerial detection survey. We've been doing this, I think, almost for a couple decades at this point, and it's a national program. So it's something that was in place long before this particular mortality event started becoming obvious. And in fact, this program has, you know, been the early detection mechanism for other sorts of mortality events that have happened in other parts of the country, particularly Colorado back in the 2000s. So what we're looking at right now in California, the map that's up here, we estimate about 27 million dead trees statewide. There's definitely hot spots, so that southern Sierra Nevada area where you're seeing a lot of the red polygons, a little bit into the transverse range on the north edge there, and then some scattered places up in the northern Sierras and into the Cascades and the Warner Mountains up at the northeast corner of the state. Mostly conifers at this point in the mid-elevation range, but as the conversation was just taking place in response to questions, we are also seeing some impacts to oaks and waiting to find out how much of that is going to turn out to be mortality. And 2015 is when I think, you know, people had been saying for a while that they saw this coming, and at least in terms of what we mapped from the sky, 2015 was when it really kind of exploded. 10 times as many dead trees last year as in the year before, triple the acres of tree mortality mapped in 2015 over 2014. So zooming in on some of these areas where we see a lot of activity, up here in the northeast corner of the state, roughly 8 million acres surveyed. You can see on these maps the sort of white lines. So those are the flight paths of the survey, and then of course once we get over forested land. And this program also, I should say, takes place on all forested lands statewide. It's not just the national forest lands. So it really is a statewide data set on the mortality that we're seeing in forests. So up in this corner of the state, roughly 524,000 acres of mortality mapped, about 2.8 million dead trees, some real pockets of white fir mortality in the Warner Mountains, as well as some white bark and lodgepole pines, and then in the Ponderosa pine, mostly west of Goose Lake and around Goose Mountain on the northern part of the Lassen National Forest. Here's some photos of those areas. I think we're all probably getting a little saturated with seeing photos of dead trees. So I'll just keep that up for a moment and then move on. But you can see, you know, the captions here tell you the different species of pine and white fir that are winking out in these different areas. Okay, the southern Sierra Nevada, this is definitely the ground zero for this event. Millions of dead trees across thousands of acres. I spent some time on the Sierra and the Sequoia National Forests last week, and on the Sierra National Forest, I'll say that they're no longer even using this data set to assess the mortality because they're basically treating it as a landscape-wide event within a certain elevation zone and certain vegetation types. And you can see the list of species here that we've mapped mortality in. This is probably roughly in descending order. One interesting thing to note here, incense cedar, which is often referred to as being pretty drought resistant, is also, and also pretty insect resistant, is also succumbing to these environmental factors. And of course, there's continuing mortality of gray pine, which is what we were really seeing a couple years ago down in the lower elevations below the national forests in the foothills. And again, 50 to 95% conifer mortality now across this large landscape between 3,000 and 5,000 to 6,000 feet in elevation. So some photos. And notice, of course, that last slide, there was a building in that photo here at Bass Lake. You know, the National Forest has a number of campgrounds around the edge of Bass Lake. Some of them have no remaining living trees in them, which is going to be a huge impact to recreation values in these areas. Okay, so the bulk of what I wanted to share this morning, that kind of sets some background of what we're talking about on the national forests. You know, the title of this talk was, How is the Forest Service Responding? And there are 5 general areas identified here. Rather than read this list to you, because we're going to dive into each of these in order, I'll just go ahead and go to the first one, which is coordination. So as you've heard, we are very much involved with the Governor's Tree Mortality Task Force. Forest Service has members on all of those task force working groups that Glenn described. And, you know, a big goal for us in participating in this is coordinated response across the landscape and also consistent messaging so that folks are hearing the same messages about this event and how we're responding across the agencies and between the state and federal government representatives. Okay, and then our focus. So Glenn mentioned the 6-county area in the South Sierras, and those overlap the 3 national forests listed here, the Stanislaus, the Sierra, the Sequoia. So that really is where we're focusing our energies internally in terms of where to respond to all the tree mortality on the national forests. And I'd say, I mean, Glenn talked about how they're prioritizing work in CAL FIRE, and I'd say we're right in step with that. So, you know, first priority is removing hazardous trees near communities, infrastructure such as roads and power lines, recreation sites. And then we're also continuing our monitoring efforts. So we're already getting geared up for the next round of aerial survey this year, probably anticipating some requests for some additional surveys besides the annual program. One thing that I'll note about all those maps I showed you is that they're probably already out of date. I think the last flights that we did would have been in the fall, and what we're hearing from the national forests is that the mortality has just continued to spread since those last flights that we did last year. So we're also, besides continuing with the aerial detection methodology, we're also looking into some ways that we could use remotely sensed data, satellite or other types of aerial photography, to get more up-to-date and real-time models of where tree mortality is occurring, and that will help us out with the planning, the response. And then a little bit of ground surveying, just, you know, when we have these remotely sensed data sets, getting some folks out on the ground just to compare to what they're seeing there. So sizing up, really getting our heads around the problem. It's the essential first step in order to plan actual response, boots on the ground. So we've been working particularly with these 3 national forests in the last couple weeks to refine what the data are telling us, to get a sense of how many facilities, how many miles of roads, We've got some preliminary estimates here on this slide. I wouldn't take these numbers much to heart, again, partly because the tree mortality continues to spread, and also as a single example, sometimes we have data, a campground in our data that has been closed for years, and so we're doing a lot of that refining and ground checking with these 3 national forests to get a better sense of just how much area and how many different types of asset we're talking about. Okay, and then of course all of this leads to actions, and so those 3 national forests have definitely not been sitting and watching trees turn red. They've had crews out removing hazardous trees from roads, trails, and campgrounds as they've been able. We're definitely starting to bump into a capability issue in terms of the number of people and chainsaws that we've got available to address this. There's also the issue for us on federal lands of needing to go through some environmental planning. And around admin sites, this is a generalization of what I'm about to say, around admin sites, it's generally easier for us to immediately address hazard trees. Within the Giant Sequoia National Monument, which covers a large chunk of the Sequoia National Forest and Sequoia Kings Canyon National Parks, that is not quite as straightforward, but they're still out there addressing things as they can and figuring out, defining the problem so that we can do the necessary NEPA analyses and documents that we need in order to continue addressing the problem. We have a lot of different permittees on the national forests, so such things as power lines, recreational residences, resorts, organizational camps. And so the forests are working with permittees to address hazard trees within the areas where they're permitted to either occupy or operate. Again, that idea of consistent messaging, so we're definitely contributing to the information sources and means of sharing information with the public about the hazards of falling trees, bark beetle biology, what the short-term and longer-term outlooks for this event look like, etc. And then, of course, as land managers, we have a responsibility for informing the public about road and recreation site closures. We're trying to get the word out now. We're still a little before the big camping season, but we already anticipate that there's going to be some closed campgrounds and roads this year, that there's going to be places it's not safe for the public to go, that we just don't have the necessary number of people to make safe by dropping hazard trees. And so, I think we're starting to get that message out that the public should be braced for some places to not be available for recreation this year. And then under this heading, continued actions, I think this is maybe the longer term look, so that last slide were the things that are happening now, and then looking down the road, again, we're going to continue to monitor the outbreak and the tree mortality and continue updating our plans as new areas succumb to this. A really long-term aspect of our planning is, actually, sorry, I'm ahead of myself. So immediately, there are these hazard zones, but we recognize that as we get more of those addressed, that we need to expand our scope of planning and mitigation of hazard trees. And somebody earlier said that we'll probably never get to all of the affected acres. I would echo that. I think that's a reasonable statement for the Forest Service to make as well. But we're planning out right now tentatively about a 10-year response, maybe up to a 15. That's still being determined. So we'll do what we can. And then finally, assessing reforestation needs, and that's the really much longer term assessment that needs to happen. And of course, one thing that we want to take into account here is climate change predictions. We're braced for the idea that some of these places, it might not make sense to try to reforest because the climate forecasts are that tree species wouldn't be able to survive in those places anyway. So that's the big picture way of describing that. There'll be a lot more analysis and assessment that will need to be done to really start making those decisions about where we're going to attempt reforestation. As has already been mentioned, we are very involved with conversations about developing biomass energy markets, particularly since a lot of the feedstock we're talking about would be coming off national forest lands. So that's an ongoing conversation for us. And two new authorities that we got in the 2014 Farm Bill that we're pretty excited about and would have been even if we were not responding to this big tree mortality event are the insect and disease designations, where we have been granted the authority to use a new categorical exclusion, which significantly streamlines the NEPA process for us. As of last year, 547 watersheds comprising about 6.7 million acres within the state of California have been designated as eligible for the use of this categorical exclusion. And I want to make sure and contextualize that statement a bit, that this does not mean we're going out to treat 6.7 million acres. And it also probably doesn't mean that we're going out to treat entire watersheds. The authority and the designation to use it is done at the watershed scale, but it doesn't imply that, that we would be treating entire watersheds with this. One aspect of this categorical exclusion is that an individual project that you would write up under this document is limited to 3,000 acres. And so that fact alone, gives you kind of a different way of looking at 6.7 million acres designated. Treatment is only 3,000 acres at a time, and it's certainly not our intention to just deploy these things all over the place. We're going to be mindful about where we put these projects, these 3,000 acre limited projects. And then the other authority that's new is this Good Neighbor Authority. And what that allows us to do is enter an agreement with the state entity, and in California it's the Natural Resources Agency as well as all of the departments that are under it, where state entities can actually either do work themselves or subcontract out work to their contractors on federal lands. And this could not be better timed given this tree mortality event that's happening. It's really going to be a great tool for us to be able to do some coordinated response to dead trees across boundaries. And it gives us a way to better leverage resources between agencies and between the federal government and the state government, so that the location of boundaries does not have to be an impediment to getting work done. We actually had a workshop 2 weeks ago that was, I'd say, about half Forest Service folks, so our opportunity to really educate folks on all of the national forests in the state, as well as a number of key partners who joined us to learn about the use of these two new authorities. And so there was a lot of ideas being generated in the room, and I think that we're going to see within the next year a lot more projects get established under these two authorities. So that's an exciting addition to our toolbox in addressing this situation. So just to conclude, public safety is absolutely the Forest Service's top priority. And the event covers a vast area. It's probably going to continue growing. Our fingers are crossed that with all the precipitation that we've gotten, as well as what's forecast for the rest of March, that this year could be the turning point in the spread. But even if that's the case, we anticipate some more dead trees this year. So what will really happen with all the new precipitation is that the rate of spread will start to slow down, but it won't probably stop this year. So it's a dynamic event with a lot of moving pieces, both out on the landscape and organizationally as we pull together our coordinated response. That's going to be a long-term response. We recognize that, and we're already starting to think about how to build some of those future anticipated steps into our current planning. We absolutely in the Forest Service are using our existing resources to the fullest. In fact, we're trying to figure out ways to get more resources to address this. which is the next bullet point here, of course. And can't stress enough how important the collaboration is on this. Bark beetles don't respect administrative boundaries, and we absolutely need to not have boundaries get in the way of a coordinated response to this problem. And I think that's the end of the planned part of the talk. I'm open to questions.